this is Todd. In this video, I want to help you as a GM develop set piece encounters that don't stink, but that also are sustainable. Now, first things first, I'm going to throw a lot of wrestling terms in here. I don't really watch wrestling anymore. I haven't really watched it in a long time, but I've always been fascinated with the business. And there is some of the things that, and I'm talking about pro wrestling here, some things that pro wrestling does that actually are very applicable to ongoing role-playing game campaigns. So I'm going to throw in some of that lingo. Hopefully I'm using it all correctly, but just be aware of that. And I'll try to explain what I mean by a term when I toss it in. But first, let me talk about what do I mean by a set piece encounter. If you think about a movie, say an action movie, people might talk about reviewers. When you see it, might talk about a real set piece, right? This is a showcase of the action. If you think of a Mission Impossible movie, you may think about a particular stunt or a sequence of stunts and fights that together are one of the high moments, one of these, what they might put on the poster or the preview, one of the real eye-grabbing, sort of edge-of-your-seat type moments in the movie. And by the same token, we talk about set-piece encounters in D&D or another role-playing game. We're talking about a similar, singular, high-moment encounter. Depending on your style, you might try to have a set-piece encounter every week. You might try to have a set-piece encounter for every encounter area. You might try to have a set-piece encounter for your boss type of fights. But these are the kind of encounters that we're hoping are memorable and interesting and in some way unique. If not, it's the only time in the game that this is going to happen, but something that is certainly elevated perhaps from the rest of the encounter. So when we talk about creating a set piece encounter, we're really talking about taking maybe the pieces that we've used in our normal encounters, but what are we doing? We're trying to elevate them, trying to make them into this really memorable, interesting moment. The problem with set piece encounters is twofold. One, they can be hard to come up with. They can be difficult. They can be taxing on your brain because you constantly want to find something new. I just mentioned, hey, there may be unique moments. Well, the longer your campaign goes on, it may be harder and harder to find unique moments. So that might be a way that is challenging to you. The other thing that can make it challenging is how do you do this without it feeling really cheap or cheesy or just out of character for the moment or out of character for your setting. There was an example. I think I read this maybe a couple of years ago now on Reddit. Someone was trying to put together this really interesting set piece encounter. Took place in a windmill. But they had put everything in the kitchen sink in this encounter. It had like blades that were swirling down. It had moving platforms. It had, it looked like, I think, walkways that were automated walkways. Sometimes were rolling around on some kind of lever or something was having these sort of moving sidewalk kind of things. And it was supposed to be in a windmill. And at a certain point, it just gets beyond, regardless of the setting, unless it was super gonzo, right? At some point, it just becomes, well, how does this make sense as a windmill? It doesn't make sense anymore. It's so far removed from the rest of the setting and the rest of the game that it becomes too transparent that you're trying to make like a really tricky, crazy encounter, as opposed to something that really seems to fit in the vein of what's happening. I think the best set piece encounters are ones that are part and parcel with the moment and build out of that moment. If to kind of go into pro wrestling, like I mentioned at the beginning, when you think about, if you've ever watched pro wrestling, you'll see they'll build towards, a pay-per-view match, right? And so you're kind of building up there so that when you get to this match, this set piece marquee match that maybe they want you to shell out money to see, and I'm thinking back in the day, you want to stay up late on Saturday and watch Saturday night's main event to check it out. It's because they've built you up to it. It's not that they just dropped a whole bunch of crazy in there. Now that can be kind of fun too, but at a certain point, again, I'll talk about it. It can actually become anti-productive. Because just as I mentioned with uniqueness and trying to stay fresh with your encounters, the more you just raise the ante like that, where do you go after you've done that, right? So you take this windmill encounter, and I believe if I'm remembering correctly, this was for a low-level party. This wasn't like at some kind of at the end game level. So you have this low-level party, and this may be their first adventure, and they've already in this crazy encounter. So they're thinking, right, oh, the next adventure, we're going to bump it up a notch. But as a GM, like, how do I bump it up a notch from there? And even if I find ways to bump it up a notch, by the time I've done that a few times, I'm going to be really grasping at straws on where to go from there. And not only that, even the further I take it, it's just going to get crazy until it becomes divorced from the game. You're already in a windmill and it's kind of crazy town, and you look at it and you go, well, how does this exist in a windmill and it make any sense? Never mind when you have to go and now it's something else, but you've got to have people floating in space, and there's got to be lightning bolts shooting around, but you don't have anything in your setting that matches that. So you're in a situation where you either have to just send things to a place that you may not want to take it as a setting, or it just becomes something where it doesn't really belong in the setting. It's out there. In wrestling, they talk about that. They use a term called hot-shotting. I think the 90s were famous when they had the Monday Night Wars, where they're constantly trying to up the ante, up the ante, up the ante. But the problem with hot-shotting is that, just like I mentioned, where do you go from there? And eventually you run out of places to go, the conceivable places you can take things, and then there's inevitable burnout from everybody involved. If you think the one encounter where you've got whirling blades and moving platforms and moving sidewalks is all happening at once is crazy enough, and then you try to take it up and up. At the end of it, as a player, you're burnt out. As a GM, I'm certainly burnt out, and it just leads to a collapse. Much like, and I don't know where hot-shotting, I'm sure hot-shotting has a phrase, but I think of like a fire where that you've got it all burning on the top, but you don't have a good core, and then just collapses into ash. So we want to try to avoid that. But let's get into the things that I think are useful for building a good set piece that, again, I think is a sustainable practice. One is, find a gimmick. And what is a gimmick in wrestling? They'll talk about gimmicks as several things. A kind of match is a gimmick. So you think about, okay, you have your regular match, then a handicap match is kind of a gimmick, right? Because they've added an element to it. Characters, they would say, are gimmicks, right? Undertaker, a famous gimmick. This originally a dead guy, then I guess a biker guy, and then a dead guy again. But you have a gimmick, this thing. And you think about it in your D&D or other role-playing game. If you're dealing with a particular faction, a particular bad guy, you can think of what their gimmick is, right? A death cult who's trying to resurrect or bring Orcus into the material plane. The gimmick, their gimmick is a death cult. So if you go to somewhere, a place where the death cult is operating, like their home base or a shrine or whatever, right? Then you want to lean into their gimmick. If it's a death cult, obviously you're going to see a lot of death elements, but you want to be iterative, particularly if this is a faction, again, going to wrestling, and you think about wrestling, you're seeing the same wrestlers every week on a returning basis. And then they might disappear for a while and then they'll be back. So the idea from a wrestling promoting and what is always, how do you keep these people interested in this wrestler without burning them out where they don't want to see them again, right? How can you keep bringing these guys around? The same thing if you think about video games, Super Mario Brothers. How do you keep a player interested from Super Mario Brothers, World 1-1 to World 1-2, right? They'll change it up, but then they'll kind of add things. So if you have guys that are going to be coming, you want to be iterative. So if you know that you're going to have 4 or 5 different adventures or different elements, parts of an adventure with the same death cult in there, don't throw everything in that first big encounter with the death cult, because again, you have nowhere to go from there, and you've kind of worn that gimmick out. Think of what things you could have. And let me give you an example. So let's say we have in chapter 1 of our adventure and our campaign of the party versus the Orcus worshipping death cult. They find a small shrine. And in that shrine, maybe they find 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 of these cult members, and they find some, say, couple of recently raised zombies. So in that shrine, whichever encounters are in that shrine, it might be something small where the shrine itself is the set piece encounter for this part of the adventure. So you've got some zombies, you've got some death cultists. Bam, they've dealt with that. Now they're going to, maybe it's part of what they found at the end of that particular encounter. They found some clues that are going to lead them to a larger death cult church or anti-church, some kind of larger religious thing. This one's going to have maybe multiple rooms. So the shrine was just essentially just one little area. Now we're going to have multiple areas. So now I might think, okay, they've seen the zombies and they've seen the dead occultists. I want them to be able to build on that. I'm not trying to make their knowledge worthless, but just like you think of Super Mario Brothers, the first time you go through kind of one level, it's giving you the pipes and the Koopas, whatever, the mushroom guys and the turtles. Then you go to the next level. Now they're going to add one more thing to it, right? Now they've got those that we've understood. Now maybe you have the plants that come out of the pipe. So now I'm thinking about if I'm going to go to essentially, let's call it world 1.2 or 1-2 of the cultists. Now I want to add that next wrinkle. So we saw cultists, we saw zombies, and we built our kind of set piece around that. Now I'm going to add skeletons into the mix, or maybe I'll add a single higher level cultist that's actually a necromancer and has some kind of death magic that he can cast. So now the party can use the knowledge they have from the first one, just like in Super Mario Brothers, you can use the knowledge you've gained in going through the initial level. Now we're going to add that new wrinkle. So that set piece might be about that, where I can feature the magic from this necromancer. Maybe there's some extra zombies. Maybe there's something else. Now if we go to the third one, we can look at another wrinkle. Maybe now we add skeletons in, or maybe now we add some kind of desecration or unhallowing of the area, right? So if we had, let's say we had our cleric in the party and they're loving this because they're getting to turn undead all the time. Now we're going to add this little wrinkle that makes it a little bit more difficult. So now we're now in this kind of third iteration. Now we have another necromancer, maybe a little bit higher level one, some more cultists, maybe some different flavors of undead instead of just zombies, maybe zombies and skeletons, maybe a ghoul. That could be its own wrinkle right there. Maybe we have this idea that it is unhallowed somehow, which then prevents or makes it more difficult for the cleric to turn. Maybe we say, hey, until you dispel this unhallowing, you can't turn these undead. They're sort of strengthened against it. So now we get to the last encounter, maybe for this arc that's got this undead cult. Now we can add a few of these together. So now you're going to have maybe a couple of necromancers or maybe a chief necromancer types. Now we're going to keep that unhallowing, but now we're going to have it tied to some kind of gem or something else there. Maybe a group of priests that are chanting something else. And now you can't dispel it. Maybe in the other one, we were saying, hey, if you're a wizard in the party, hey, they could dispel it. And that would kill the unhallowing, which then allowed the cleric to come in and turn. Now we've added a new wrinkle. Well, hey, now they can't turn it until you've turned off the unhallowing, but the unhallowing can't be turned off until you deal with this gem or this ritual or something else that's going on. So we've created something over multiple encounters. Each one of them is a set piece in its own right, but we're not trying to do everything in one go. We're saying, okay, let's iterate. We have this idea. We have this gimmick. The gimmick is a death cult. So first step, here's our set piece. Second step, here's our set piece. Third step, fourth step, until we get to that last one. In wrestling terms, maybe called the blow off, where we're going to be done with the death cult for a while. So we're going to have this kind of even bigger piece. If you want to think about it, it's kind of like going through the calendar, the WWE calendar, and you go through, okay, we're going to have a couple of matches and we get to the pay-per-view, and the pay-per-views, we're going to have the bigger match. But each one of them can be a set piece. Each one of them is a set piece. But instead of just saying, okay, we're going to start with the last one and then figure out how to go up to 11, like Spinal Tap from there, let's start and say, okay, let's build it up. 5, we'll start at level 5, then level 7, level 9, and then finally a level 11 at the end of it, where boom, it all goes off. And the reason why I would call this sustainable is because, one, everything is built in a way that hopefully makes sense in your setting. Because one of the things I think is really important is that your setting remains consistent. That has to do with the reality, the shared reality that you're all in, that everyone's in while they're playing. While you're doing your play, you want everything to make sense in that reality. You don't want to get so far afield with leaning into a gimmick or trying to curate something memorable that your setting just gets blown out of the water. And I talked about this before. We're also dealing with the particular elements that you can use them over and over again. You can repeat them, and you're only adding little bits at a time even though it might seem at the end of the day, we've got 5 or 6 elements that are creating this puzzle, right? 1, multiple necromancers or a chief necromancer. 2, some kind of ritual or some kind of magic item or something else that's creating an effect. 3, the undead and perhaps the fact they can't get turned. It seems complex, but it's all building up things that we've already gone through and know. So as the players we have the tools to understand this challenge in front of us. I often have a hard time with puzzles. I just don't love them so much. And the reason is that most often the puzzles have nothing to do with the game. They're not things about you learning in the game. It's about, okay, now figure out how to do this word game I'm going to give you, or do this other puzzle. And I know some people like that. And I'm not trying to throw shade on you if that's your jam. But me, the kind of puzzles I like are like this, where we have these elements. And as players, if I've been paying attention, I've seen all this stuff build up. I've seen the undead, I've seen the necromancer, I've seen this unhallowed effect, and now I'm seeing it all together. And so I have the tools as the players to be able to sit there and say, okay, we've had all these experiences that lead us up to this point where now we have to put all this knowledge to the test. And it might take us a couple of rounds. Maybe the first round, the cleric tries to just turn undead and it's not working, or they realize right away, oh, there must be another unhallowed effect here. So wizard dispel it, but that doesn't seem to work. And now your gears are turning, but all the pieces are there. So not only do you have this set piece that I think will be memorable, and part of that memorability will be about all these steps you've taken to get there, but it's not some weird puzzle that has nothing to do with reality. We're not all of a sudden going to stop the game and say, okay, now look at this Sudoku and solve it, and now you'll have the key to this encounter. No, it's all there for you. The puzzle is all part and parcel of the fiction that we've created together. It just all comes together in this set piece. And then after that, if the death cult comes back, you can riff on what they've already seen. So you think about, Star Wars. So you think about Star Wars. The first Death Star had this flaw. Empire, the Empire is still there, but they're kind of on the down low in a sense. They chase the rebels around. They force them off of the ice planet, and they kind of send them. But really, they're regrouping, right? Then the Death Star comes back in the third one, and it's still the Death Star, but now it's different. And now you can't just, okay, we can't do what we did before, but we kind of understand it as players were, as the rebels were aware of it. We kind of understand. Now we got to figure out this new element, and of course they do, right? So it doesn't have the weakness as the first Death Star did, but they can use the same kind of tools. And those same tools were, figure out how to defeat it, and then, create a strike force to go in and do that. So they're able to use the knowledge and training in a way from their experiences in the first one, but they have to do something else. So now that if the death cult goes away after we've done all this stuff, maybe they come back and we can do a twist on it. We can have fun playing with that twist. So now the first time the party comes up on them again, some elements might be the same. Maybe we just stuck with skeletons and zombies. Now when the death call comes back, they've learned something, and now they've got ghouls, which are somewhat more intelligent. They're more mobile. They're deadlier, right? They've learned. Skeletons and zombies didn't cut it, so now we've upped our game to ghouls, and this might force the party to have to do different things to do it. Maybe now the unhallowing effect, they've created these black iron bands that go around the ghouls' necks. And so now you got to figure out something to do with that, or dispel them individually. You can't dispel them, a single effect. You got to hit each one of them, right? We think of all kinds of ways that we can make this more unique. It's different. And you can then build up to another set piece, and it doesn't undo all the knowledge that the players have, but it gives it that twist. So I hope that gives you an idea of how to build a much more sustainable encounters, because what we don't want in our games is to, hotshot ourselves. In other words, create a series of encounters that, yes, they're getting bigger and grander and more complicated, but does that complexity become too much to manage to the point where we're going to lose track of things? Players aren't going to be able to get it. And two, it takes us to a level so fast that there's really nowhere to go from there. And it ends up killing our session, potentially killing our game, definitely, killing the tension, because we're always going to be pushed to do more. And so you always want to leave yourself space to do more. But after that blow off, then you get to reset a little bit. So if you try to work on that pattern, and again, wrestling is a great model for that, where you're sort of building up, blow off, and then go down, right? Different opponents come. You think about, okay, these two guys fought, Hogan and, Randy Savage were fighting each other. Then they had that pay-per-view match. Then someone won, someone lost, boom. And then the next night, all of a sudden they're starting something else. And so now Hogan will be matched with Iron Sheik. and Savage might start feuding with somebody else. Boom. And then that goes. And then after a while, 6 months, maybe it's back to being Hogan versus the Macho Man again. But they've given it a rest. They've had that blow off. And then, but it's not to the point where you can't understand what's happening afterwards, or it no longer makes sense. I think when those things go bad, it's when you end up in a final encounter, a final match, if you will, that just is totally outside the realms of the reality that you set, that just doesn't make sense anymore. So we want to avoid that. And I hope the example with the cult can, helps with that. And the gimmick can be many things. Maybe you don't have a death cult. Maybe you're working on, there's a particular dungeon that a party is exploring. So you want to think about the gimmick of that place. If you go back to video games again, we all know the cliches of, okay, we've got the lava world, the ice world, the forest world, and we don't want to get that generic with it, because of course, if we make this place the forest tomb, we're probably going to have more than one forest area. But we can drill down in there as GMs. We've done lots of world building here. We probably have a whole list of things about this particular. Okay, so someone was buried here. They were an arch druid who followed a horned god. Maybe that god's the symbol or that animal was a giant elk. Okay. So now let's focus in on that. Okay, a giant elk. What kind of things can we come up with a giant elk that are interesting? And then how do we take those and then create them in this place so that we can build up to some kind of unique set piece encounter there? So let's go with elk imagery. Maybe we do things that there's lots of in the place itself. There's a lot of elk imagery. Maybe the layouts even sort of follow the horns kind of shape, the antlers, right? They would follow kind of the way antlers might curve. If you pay attention, they might follow that. You can really do a good job. You can really have fun with that and then utilize that in the set piece. So places can have gimmicks as well as factions or individual opponents. With a place, we already talked about where maybe if you had a faction like the Death Cult, you could build up some unique pieces that will help create and establish your set piece encounter over multiple iterations. With a place, this may be where those iterations are taking place in one space. So use the space to build up these elements. Talking about an arch druid and a giant elk totem, for example, that represents the symbol of his god, you would look at these different things, right? We mentioned maybe the layout of the place looks like maybe it's antlers. Maybe there's some other elements where I might look in Wikipedia and learn something about elks and what they do. What are the enemies? What eats elks? What do elks eat? Those might enter into it. And beyond that, just what are some interesting things we might do in a druid's abode or something? Maybe that's a place that was a specific burial place of this druid. What are some kind of druidic features that we might have in there? And then we can build them up, right? So we start off maybe with antler shapes of the actual location itself to when we get to where we're going to have the set piece encounter, maybe around the sarcophagus holding the druid. Maybe that has an interesting shape to it that is reflective of giant elks. Maybe in that final room, we will face some kind of souped up spiritual giant elk type creature. And these creatures, maybe in smaller versions or lower powered versions, will show up in the extra spaces. Maybe those, we can give them one or two abilities that can show up little bits. And then when we get to the one at the end, maybe that one has all of the abilities that we've showed off. So let's say the giant elk can do kind of a blinking, phase step kind of feature where it sort of makes it leap and then it can appear somewhere else. Then there's another one that maybe the antlers do lightning bolt. And so maybe they'll see some of these elk that have the lightning bolt. Some of the other ones may have that misty step, phase step kind of move. We get to the boss, it's got both of those. So we've built up this encounter, right? The same thing with the space. Maybe there's things where we have elk prints that are somehow pressed or almost seared into the stone of the floor. Maybe those do things. And we can introduce some elements there that when we get to the set piece encounter, those feature as well. With you have to do something with the prints, or those prints tell you something about how the encounter works. So then, right, we're building up to this set piece, and then hopefully by the time we get to the set piece, all the stuff they've gone through to get there will make sense. There'll be a puzzly aspect, there'll be a memorable, hopefully, aspect because you're putting all this together, but it won't feel overwhelming for anyone because they've been eased into it. We've taken these iterations and we've built them up. So we've looked at set piece encounters for a faction or working from a faction, set piece encounters working from a place. I think that pretty much, I'm not sure what else there is to cover outside of there. I think we can look at combinations of those, right? Because once you get one of those set, you can look at how you might deal with them together. So, for example, there is another faction who's been trying to work through this same resting place of the Archdruid. So now, how might they interact with these different elements, and what elements do we know from them? So maybe you've been iterating off of this death cult. The death cult is there. They've been doing something. They feel like if they can get this, make an undead servant of this Archdruid, they'll be super powerful. So now they're in this space. We've now built up these other things. Now we can build on all of them. And if, say, for example, that they succeed in raising the Archdruid, then down the line, here we have another twist, one way of taking it up a notch. Now, instead of just zombie humanoids, maybe, and skeletal humanoids, now we start introducing zombie animals, skeletal animals, and maybe that giant elk again can feature in. So we're able to take these things, continue building, but in a way that we can really sustain that over time. And we have directions where we can follow and go. And the players in their brains will have something. I think it's important to keep in mind, the players. Keep in mind that all these things we're throwing at them should feel like they can handle, should feel solvable, should feel to be of a piece of what they're doing. They're not in one space, then they go on this encounter, and they seem like they've just been transported into another space. And I always go back to Final Fantasy VII. You're walking across the desert, maybe mountains, but whatever it is, when you get into an encounter, it's like you're warped out of there. You're warped into this flat area that's always the same where the encounter takes place. Just has a different, backdrop, right? We don't want to feel that way. We don't want to feel like the players are being warped out of the fiction into something else so that they can have all kinds of craziness or whatever with the encounter. We want to feel like it all makes sense. And I think that these strategies, if you put them all together, will help your encounters make sense. We'll keep them memorable, but we'll do this in a way that's sustainable for you as the GM to plan, because the worst thing is when you're building, and you end up in that spot where you realize you've just hot-shotted things. You realize you can't take things any further reasonably without everything falling apart. Anyhow, as with all these videos, if you enjoy these, give it a thumbs up, give it a like. That really helps me out. Please subscribe if you want to see more videos by me about various things. There's the bell icon you can use to get immediate notifications when I publish. But have a great rest of your day or night, or whenever you're watching or listening to this. Game on, and I will talk to you later.